Last time we covered Crenshaw, we were discussing the treatment of Black women and marginalized communities of color in employment discrimination. And here we're shifting our attention to the treatment of Black women and marginalized communities of color in cases of violence, particularly sexual violence, in the case of battering and rape in particular. Some of her main themes here are that the standard feminist approach to issues of battery and rape do not address the situations of Black women or other women of color at all to the extent that it should. As well, we see on the other hand, anti-racist lobbyists and communities fail to recognize the specific plight of the women in their communities. And so women of color and Black women are in a particularly difficult position with respect to being given the appropriate care or resources available to better their circumstances. So we can focus our attention first on shelters for victims of battery. So shelters for women cannot just focus on the physical assault that leads one to seek shelter. They often also have to work on other multi-layered and routinized forms of domination that converge on this issue. So issues of unemployment, lack of job skills, childcare responsibilities, and poverty, these are the background conditions that lead to a particular vulnerability for Black women and women of color. Intervention strategies that focus only on the dominant group will fail to serve the marginalized. So, for example, in the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1990, it initially required that one be with one's partner for 2 years in a marriage before they can acquire citizenship. So many immigrant women were then reluctant to leave their husbands for fear of deportation or failure to acquire citizenship. This was eventually amended to allow exceptions in the case of domestic violence. But to get the waiver, you would have to file reports, you'd have to have evidence of affidavit forms from police, you'd have to have forms from medical personnel, psychologists, school officials, social service agencies, and so on. But many of these are too burdensome or simply inaccessible to get for women whose privacy or access to the outside world or who are in a particularly vulnerable community, for example, a community heavily policed. These options are just not available. So in that case, many women will fall through the cracks. There's also a serious information access issue as well for women in color in different communities. So information might not be in a language that's spoken. They might not have access to this information. If they're in a particularly abusive environment, they might be, without any kind of privacy, they might be relegated to the home. As well, people who are married to undocumented persons might refuse to seek help for fear of pushing their loved ones into deportation or even themselves. So any kind of road to citizenship or so on that's going to be not taking into account these perspectives is going to be short on treating women of color and Black women with the appropriate amount of care that they deserve. Certain communities or political strategies that ignore intersectional issues can be obscuring and jeopardizing for different political interests, particularly of women of color and Black women. So she gives an anecdote of an attempt to get statistics by the LAPD on arrests for domestic violence by racial group. The department, according to the department, was pressured not to release this information, not because, at least according to them, because they didn't want to release it, but because various minority communities opposed the release of those statistics, fearing that the data would unfairly represent Black and brown communities as unusually violent, which then might justify using further policing on those communities. And on the other hand, feminists were also concerned that the revelation of that data would paint domestic violence as only a minority problem, thus resulting in less support for these kinds of anti-domestic violence programs. And so you can see here kind of a pincer move from communities of color who are prioritizing the men in the communities and then communities of, say, feminism, which are prioritizing the white interests in that community. Actual efforts to stem the politicization of domestic violence and anti-racist politics are often grounded in attempts to maintain the integrity of the community. So, for example, she suggests that feminism commonly is considered as having no place in communities of color. The issues are considered internally divisive, or they are sometimes outlined as representing a migration of white women's concerns into a context in which they are irrelevant and harmful. And this can be taken to a particularly extreme degree, as seen in Ali's book, The Black Man's Guide to Understanding the Black Woman, in which Ali argues in favor of domestic violence as a means of asserting Black dominance, so as to disrupt the racism that occurs with Black women being more, afraid of white men. So the idea is that Black women are too deferential to white men when they in fact should be deferential to Black men. Crenshaw points out that this is particularly dangerous. It establishes a dangerous pattern for children raised in these environments and can contribute to other problems. So nearly 40% of all homeless women and children have fled violence in the home, and this just supports that kind of violence persisting. As well, 63% of the children and men between 11 and 20, we really should say youth at this point, are imprisoned for homicide. 63% of those that are imprisoned for homicide are there for killing their mother's batterers. So this can have other kind of effects than just being homeless or fleeing the home. More commonly, the political or cultural interests of the community are interpreted in a way that precludes full public recognition of the problem of domestic violence. The example that she gives is in the work The Color Purple. Some have criticized Alice Walker for representing Black men as particularly violent, and that no Black women were like her main character. Crenshaw argues that the problem here is not the portrayal of violence by Black men, but that in our society there are few other depictions. So nevertheless, suppressing the issue of violence against Black women in the name of anti-racism imposes real costs on Black women. Race and culture also suppresses Black women in that Black women are often reluctant to call the police, given the hostility of police in Black communities. There's also a tendency for violence against women of color to be seen as just another manifestation of racism, which then reconfigures violence against women of color as discrimination against men. The idea here is that because Black men are subject to increased violence by the hands of police and other members in society, that is then in turn passed on down to violence against women. And Crenshaw argues that this puts violence against women on the back seat. Looking at this from the domestic violence approach, feminist concerns also undermine minority experiences. So white feminist activists tend to think of battery as only affecting the poor or the marginalized. Often the marginalized are considered an other, as in the Violence Against Women Act of 1991. So here we see what she's referring to. As subtly suggested by the opening comments of Senator David Boren, in support of the Violence Against Women Act of 1991, the displacement of the other as the presumed victim of domestic violence works primarily as a political appeal to rally white elites. Boren said, so we can see what it is that she's referring to here on 1260. As subtly suggested by the opening comments of Senator David Boren, in support of the Violence Against Women Act of 1991, the displacement of the other as the presumed victim of domestic violence works primarily as a political appeal to rally white elites. Boren said, violent crimes against women are not limited to the streets of the inner cities, but also occur in homes in the urban and rural areas across the country. Violence against women affects not only those who are actually beaten and brutalized, but indirectly affects all women. Today, our wives, mothers, daughters, sisters, and colleagues are held captive by fear generated by these violent crimes, held captive not for what they do or who they are, but solely because of gender. So rather than focusing on and illuminating how violence is disregarded when the home is othered, the strategy implicit in Senator Boren's remarks functions instead to politicize the problem only in the dominant community. This strategy permits white women victims to come into focus, but does little to disrupt the patterns of neglect that permitted the problem to continue as long as it was imagined to be a minority problem. The experience of violence by minority women is ignored, except to the extent it gains white support for domestic violence programs in the white community. There's another particularly egregious case in discussions about domestic violence, like in media representation. Women of color are often not humanized. The violence that is imposed on them is exceptionally graphic, and they tend to be critical of women of color for not participating with prosecutors, which then has this implication that the battery is their fault. The institutions that are supposed to be supporting women in the cases of domestic violence tends to be built around white women, often requiring individuals to, say, take counseling and participate in working groups. And she gives an example of a Latinx woman who was particularly marginalized because she didn't speak English. And so she and her child were refused shelter. They couldn't satisfy some of the blanket requirements that the shelter imposed. This is described by Diana Campos. So the Latinx woman was denied shelter, put through multiple back and forths, denied her child from actually translating for her, kind of perversely, on the grounds that it would further victimize her. Eventually, the Latinx woman dropped away after the shelter said they'd take her, but it was so many times back and forth that it's hard to think that the Latinx woman was at all trusting this particular approach. And it's just unclear what happened to that person. So this shows a case where a feminist support group's own policies has disempowering consequences for women who don't match the kind of client that the administrators imagine. You can see that this could probably be helped if they had services that were offered by people there that were bilingual or multilingual, but that just wasn't offered here because the imagination was that was not the clientele. Feminist coalitions also tend to think of women of color as an afterthought, and if they do consider women of color, say because they've received a grant to do so, they tend to then be resistant to letting women of color take any lead in servicing their community. So they'll deny leaders from the community who'd be effective in offering services for that community on the grounds that they don't fit that community's conception of feminism. Racism and sexism also extend into dominant conceptions of rape, not just conceptions of battery. So historically, the dominant conception of rape is with a Black offender and a white victim. This subjects Black men to legal and extralegal violence. It justifies things like lynchings, or at least it purports to justify things like lynchings. It's used that way. It's also used to criminalize Black men. Early rape law itself emphasizes the property-like aspect of women's chastity, so it's the interest of white men in women's chastity, which suggests that women who have been raped are in some way devalued. Now, in these laws, women often would have to show that they tried to resist the rape to their utmost ability for it to not count as simply an instance of seduction. And this kind of stuff continues with, say, the common practice of women being put on trial in their own rape cases. So prosecutors will tend to look for anything that shows that they deserved it or asked for it by virtue of the clothing that they were wearing, the time of day that they were out, and other past sexual experiences that they might have had. So the publicized case of the New York Central Park rape made the story of sexual victimization inseparable from the rhetoric of rape. So this is the famous Central Park 5 case. Black men were labeled as savages, wolves, beasts, super predators, etc. This prompted Donald Trump at the time to put out an ad in several New York newspapers calling for bringing back the death penalty. So at the time of this case, there are many other cases of rapes that were just as horrific. For example, one woman of color was raped, sodomized, and thrown 50 feet off atop of a 4-story building in Brooklyn, shattering several of her bones. But none of these cases elicited the kind of public expressions of outrage. And Crenshaw thinks that this suggests that certain women's bodies are held to a higher regard than others. And this is reinforced by the kind of prison time that's given for people who have raped women or have been convicted of raping women. So the average prison term for a man convicted of raping a Black woman was just 2 years, for a Latinx woman 5, and for white women 10. Black women are also the least likely to be believed when they bring forth complaints about or allegations or accusations of rape. And the primary beneficiaries of policies supported by feminists and others concerned about rape, they tend to be white women. The primary beneficiaries of the Black community's concern over racism and rape, well, they tend to be Black men. We can see how race intersects with the issues raised by the anti-rape lobby. So the common feminist criticism of anti-rape law has focused on the way that past sexual behavior and norms of sexuality are brought to bear in the veracity or the truthfulness of a victim's allegations of rape. Now, sexualized images of Black folks commonly portray them as more sexual, earthy, or gratification-oriented. Black girls, as we saw with the Misogynoir article by Moya Bailey, are depicted or interpreted or viewed as being more sexually mature. Black women are thus prepackaged as bad women. The very representation of a Black woman's body at least suggests narratives that their rape is less believable or important. And these norms, Crenshaw argues, have not been challenged by the feminist lobbying to date. So we can see how rape intersects with anti-racist critiques. So according to anti-racist critiques, these largely focus on how the law operates to condemn rapes of white women by Black men. But Crenshaw argues that those focuses tend to disregard Black women. The direct assault on Black womanhood by either white men or Black men is less frequently seen as an assault on the Black community. And she gives the example of the Mike Tyson trial. So notable Black leaders in this trial provide support to Tyson and voice very little to no concern for Desiree Washington, the accuser. Washington was also further vilified by some in the community, even by those who have themselves experienced or report having experienced sexual assault. There's commonly a tendency to think of Washington as having to ask for it. And Crenshaw remarks that prosecutors tend to avoid including women as potential jurors because women actually tend to empathize the least with the victim. And Crenshaw kind of diagnoses this as maybe this would let women identify too closely with the victimization, and that might reveal their own vulnerability, and maybe that's uncomfortable or something. She also analyzes how rape and intersectionality works in social scientific research. So she argues even here, the social scientific research agenda focuses on racism in terms of Black men. So Black men accused of raping white women are treated more harshly, while Black offenders accused of raping Black women were treated most leniently. She argues that the work that she's considering uses a sexual stratification theory underneath their explanations for this phenomena. So on this view, women are differently valued according to their race, and then there are different rules of sexual access that govern who may have sexual contact with whom in a sexually stratified market. So the idea is that white women are only available to white men, whereas white men have access to white women and Black women, and Black men have access to Black women alone and don't have access to white women. So on this approach, she argues, Black men are discriminated against in that their forced access to white women is more harshly punished than their forced access to Black women. This approach, she argues, is silent on the subordination of Black women to white women. The emphasis here is on Black men's inequality with white men in their treatment by consequence of raping Black women or white women. So Black women here aren't seen as victims in their own right. They're instead seen as the means by which discrimination against Black men can be recognized. But Black women are not only discriminated against because white men can rape them with little sanction, but also because intraracial rape of white women is treated more seriously than intraracial rape of Black women. But this isn't seen as racist because intraracial rape does not involve a contest between Black and white men. Black women who are raped are racially discriminated because their rapists, whether Black or white, are less likely to be charged with rape and less likely to receive significant jail time than the rapists of white women. So she's criticizing this approach by thinking or framing discrimination in terms of who Black or white men have access to. And by focusing on that, they ignore the specific ways in which Black women are discriminated against when compared to white women. So the rape of white women is more seriously taken into account than the rape of Black women, whether it's intraracial or interracial. So this analysis of discrimination fails to recognize, yet again, the perspectives of Black women. Okay, so there are other compounding issues with the marginalizations of rape. So cases involving Black women tend to be dismissed outright, especially if they're poor, if they're substance abusers or prostitutes. One reason is because police tend to think these cases are hopelessly tainted by women who are transient, uncooperative, untruthful, or not credible as witnesses in court. So the effort to politicize violence against women will do little to address the experiences of Black and other non-white women until the ramifications of racial stratification among women is acknowledged. At the same time, the anti-racist agenda will not be furthered by suppressing the reality of intraracial violence against women of color. The effect of both of these marginalizations is that women of color have no ready means to link their experiences with those of other women, and this sense of isolation compounds efforts to politicize sexual violence within communities of color and permits the deadly silence around these issues. So this is kind of the main thesis here of this entire article, that the kind of blind spots from the perspective of anti-racist policies and anti-sexist policies tend to ignore Black women and women of color. She also discusses this in a more kind of I would say a cultural instance. It intersects with law as well. But she gives an in-depth analysis of the misogyny and racism in the Two Live Crew case. We're not going to go too much into the details here, but I will outline what is going on. So our general argument here is that racism is likely the reason why the Two Live Crew case was considered obscene and brought to court. Various outlets attempted to use Black women as justification for thinking of the Two Live Crew case worthy of censorship. But what she argues is that they really had in mind white women. And the worry was that the lyrics in the artist's work was going to motivate Black youth to rape white women. And this is ironic because some of those same speakers who were advocating for this view in other articles disagreed that white supremacist speech would motivate young white people from enacting racist violence. So she remarks, like, what's the difference here between the two? And it seems to be saying that Black youth are particularly more impressionable or something like that. At the same time, anti-racist positions downplayed the legitimate worries about sexism and misogyny towards Black women. So she has this quote here, humor in which women are objectified as packages of bodily parts to serve whatever male bonding or male competition needs men please, subordinates women in much the same way that racist humor subordinates African Americans. So claims that incidences of such humor are just jokes and are not meant to injure or be taken literally do little to blunt their demeaning quality, nor for that matter does the fact that the jokes are told within the intra-group cultural tradition. And for those that were supporting Two Live Crew's cultural value of the things that they were saying for the promotion of the Black community, she argues those who deployed Black women in the service of condemning Two Live Crew's misogynistic representations did not do so in the interest of empowering Black women. Rather, they had other interests in mind, the pursuit of which was racially subordinating. And then on the other side, the spirited defense of Two Live Crew was no more about defending the entire Black community than the prosecution was about defending Black women. After all, Black women, whose very assault is the subject of the representation, can hardly regard the right to be represented as bitches and whores as essential to their interest. So again, she outlines Black women and women of color as being ignored by feminist concerns, and then ignored by anti-racist concerns. Whenever the plight of Black women or women of color is used, it's generally used in the context of defending white women or for some racist motive.